So let's talk about what happened in the early hours of November 14th, 2025. Picture this. It's just past midnight on Russia's Black Sea coast. The city of Novorossiysk, this massive port city that most people have never heard of, is quiet. The oil terminal workers are on their night shift. Tankers are docked, waiting to load crude oil destined for global markets. It's routine, boring even, and then the sky lights up, not from fireworks, from explosions, multiple explosions, the kind that shake windows kilometers away, the kind that people film on their phones and immediately upload to Telegram, their hands trembling as they hold the camera. Within minutes, a massive fire is raging at the scavenged oil terminal. Orange flames climb into the night sky. Black smoke billows across the port. Air raid sirens wail. And somewhere in the chaos, an S-400 air defense system, one of Russia's most sophisticated pieces of military hardware, gets obliterated. By sunrise, Russia's second largest oil export facility is completely shut down. Not damaged, not reduced, shut down. 2.2 million barrels per day of oil exports just stopped. That's 2% of the entire world's oil supply, gone in one night. And here's the thing that makes this remarkable. This wasn't NATO. This wasn't the United States. This wasn't some massive coalition operation with billion-dollar stealth bombers. This was Ukraine, using missiles they built themselves, with engines they literally dug out of landfills. But this story isn't really about one attack on one oil terminal. It's about something much bigger. Because the same night Ukraine hit Novorossiysk, Russia launched 430 drones and 18 missiles at Kyiv. Apartment buildings burned, children were wounded, people died. Two countries locked in a brutal war, both striking at what hurts most. Ukraine hitting Russia's wallet, Russia hitting Ukraine's civilians. And the question nobody's really asking is this: what happens when you take the world's biggest oil exporter and methodically, systematically destroy its ability to sell that oil? What we're watching isn't just military strategy. It's economic warfare. It's the slow strangulation of a petrostate's lifeline, and it's working. So let's dig into what actually happened that night, why it matters, and what it tells us about where this war is really heading. Here's what happened. Let's get specific. Night of November 13th into November 14th, 2025. Around midnight local time, Ukrainian forces launched a massive coordinated strike across southern Russia. We're talking 216 drones. Not a small raid. This was a swarm. 66 of those drones were aimed at the Krasnodar region, where Novorossiysk is located. 59 more were sent over the Black Sea. The rest fanned out across other Russian regions as diversionary targets. The primary target was the scavenged oil terminal complex in Novorossiysk. And to understand why that matters, you need to know what Novorossiysk is. This is Russia's largest Black Sea port. It's the endpoint for Transneft pipelines, Transneft being Russia's state-owned pipeline monopoly. It's a warm water port, meaning it operates year-round when Russia's northern ports freeze over. And in October 2025 alone, this terminal exported 3.22 million tons of crude oil. It's not just Russian oil, by the way. Kazakhstan routes some of its exports through here too. So when you hit Novorossiysk, you're not just hitting Russia, you're disrupting regional oil markets. Now, the Ukrainians didn't just send drones. According to Ukraine's general staff, they used long Neptune missiles. These are the same weapons that sank the Russian cruiser Moskva back in 2022. The upgraded version has a 1,000-kilometer range. That's over 600 miles. Some reports suggest they also use something called the Flamingo missile, and we'll get to that in a minute, because the Flamingo it's kind of wild. So the strike happens. Multiple impacts across the terminal. A massive fire breaks out. We're talking flames that burned for hours into November 14th. Satellite imagery from NASA's FIRMS system picked up multiple fire signatures. Videos showed the orange glow lighting up the night sky. But here's where it gets interesting. The Ukrainians also destroyed an S-400 air defense system stationed at nearby military unit 1537. That's significant. The S-400 is supposed to be Russia's answer to advanced threats. It's what they've been using to protect high-value targets, and it got taken out. By morning, Transneft had suspended all crude oil flows through the terminal, not reduced. Suspended, the port stopped receiving oil, stopped loading tankers, 761,000 barrels per day gone. A state of emergency was declared in Novorossiysk. 172 emergency personnel were deployed to fight the fires. 4 apartment buildings were damaged, 2 private homes. 3 crew members on civilian vessels were wounded, and global oil prices, they jumped 2%. Not a huge spike, but enough to notice, enough for markets to react. Now, here's what makes this even more significant. At the exact same time, literally the same night, Russia launched its own massive attack on Kyiv. 430 drones, 18 missiles, Iskanders, Kinjals, Zircons, Calibers. All 10 districts of Kyiv were hit. 6 to 7 people were killed, 35 injured, including children and a pregnant woman. 11 apartment buildings damaged or on fire, so you have this simultaneous exchange. Ukraine hitting infrastructure, Russia hitting civilians, both sides going for maximum impact. But the difference, and this is important, is that Ukraine is hitting what funds Russia's war machine. Russia is hitting apartment buildings. That asymmetry tells you something about where each side is in this conflict and what their strategies actually are. Let's talk about what this actually means. Not the politics, not the strategy, just the immediate measurable consequences. First, economics. 2.2 million barrels per day of Russian oil exports are offline. To put that in perspective, that's about 5% of all seaborne oil supplies globally. It's roughly equivalent to what Venezuela exports in a year. Russia isn't just losing the oil sitting in storage at Novorossiysk. They're losing the ability to fulfill contracts. Tankers that were supposed to dock and load can't. Buyers who were expecting shipments are now scrambling for alternatives. And every day that terminal stays offline, Russia loses money. How much? Well, Brent crude was trading around $85 a barrel in November 2025. 2.2 million barrels per day times $85 is $187 million per day. That's what's not flowing. Now, Russia doesn't get the full $85 per barrel. They're selling at a discount because of sanctions. But even at a discount, we're talking well over $100 million a day in lost revenue. Second, strategic disruption. Novorossiysk isn't just an oil terminal. It's where Russia relocated parts of its Black Sea fleet after Ukrainian strikes on Sevastopol in September 2023. 14 Russian warships moved to Novorossiysk specifically because they thought it was safer. The attack also damaged a container terminal adjacent to the oil facility. That means military supplies moving through the port are disrupted. Logistics chains are broken. And Russia's already struggling with logistics in this war. Third, psychological impact. This is the part nobody's really talking about, but it matters. Imagine you're a Russian citizen. You've been told for 3 years that your military is strong, your defenses are impenetrable, your country is winning this war. And then you wake up one morning to videos of your second largest oil terminal on fire, explosions lighting up the sky, emergency sirens wailing. And here's the twist. The explosions are happening on Russian soil, hundreds of kilometers from the Ukrainian border, behind multiple layers of air defense. And the drones and missiles still got through. That's not what winning looks like. Fourth, insurance and market confidence. When a major oil terminal gets hit, insurers start reevaluating risk. Shipping companies start charging higher rates to dock in Russian ports. Some companies stop doing business there entirely. We saw this after repeated Ukrainian strikes on Crimean ports. Insurance costs spiked. Some tankers refused to enter the Black Sea. And the same thing is happening now with Novorossiysk. Fifth, immediate retaliation. Russia's response wasn't strategic or measured. It was rage. 430 drones on Kyiv, 18 missiles, hitting residential areas, hospitals, schools. The Azerbaijan embassy in Kyiv was damaged by Iskander missile fragments, which, by the way, creates a diplomatic mess Russia didn't need. Heating networks were destroyed in multiple districts, leaving people without heat as winter approaches. But here's the thing about retaliation. It doesn't undo the damage. It doesn't restart the oil terminal. It doesn't restore the revenue. All it does is kill civilians and burn through Russia's missile stockpiles. And that's the trap Russia's in. Every time Ukraine hits an oil facility, Russia feels compelled to respond. But their response costs them missiles they can't easily replace. While Ukraine's response, hitting more oil infrastructure, costs Russia money they desperately need. It's not symmetrical warfare, it's economic chess. And Russia's running out of pieces. Let's talk about who's actually making these decisions, because this isn't random. This is calculated. On the Ukrainian side, you have President Zelensky and his military leadership, and they've been very clear about their strategy. In September 2025, Zelensky said, and this is a direct quote, "The most effective sanctions, the ones that work the fastest, are the fires at Russia's oil refineries." Think about that. The president of Ukraine is openly stating that burning Russian oil infrastructure is more effective than Western economic sanctions. That's not a military talking point. That's economic doctrine. The architect of this campaign is likely General Valery Zaluzhny, Ukraine's former commander-in-chief who became an advisor on strategic operations. Under his guidance, Ukraine shifted from purely defensive operations to offensive strikes deep inside Russia. But here's where it gets interesting. These strikes require approval at the highest levels. Every major attack on Russian infrastructure needs sign-off from Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council. This isn't rogue commanders going off script. This is state policy. Now, on the Russian side, you have Putin. And Putin's in a very specific kind of bind. Russia's federal budget depends on oil and gas revenues. Estimates vary, but it's somewhere between 30 to 50% of the total budget. When oil prices are high and exports are flowing, Russia has money to fund its military, pay pensions, maintain infrastructure. When those exports get disrupted, the budget falls apart. And here's Putin's calculation. He can't just end the war. Too much is invested, too many casualties, too much propaganda about restoring Russian greatness. Backing down now would be political suicide. But he also can't defend everything. Russia's air defense systems are spread thin. They're covering the front line in Ukraine, protecting major cities, guarding strategic facilities. When Ukraine launches 200 drones at once, some are going to get through. It's math. So Putin does what he's always done. He escalates, he retaliates, he hits civilian targets to send a message. But that message isn't working anymore. Ukraine isn't intimidated. And the West, well, the West is mostly watching from the sidelines. Which brings us to the other players, the United States and Europe. In March 2025, the United States asked Ukraine to pause its strikes on Russian oil infrastructure. Why? Because oil prices were rising. American voters don't like expensive gas. So the Biden administration quietly suggested a 30-day pause. Ukraine agreed, Russia also agreed. And both sides immediately violated it. That tells you everything about how seriously anyone takes Western mediation at this point. Ukraine knows the United States won't cut off military aid over oil strikes. Russia knows Europe needs its gas. Everyone's calling everyone else's bluff. And then there's the insurance companies, the shipping conglomerates, the oil traders. These people don't care about geopolitics. They care about risk and profit. And right now, Russian ports are high risk, low profit. So ships are being redirected, insurance premiums are spiking, long-term contracts are being renegotiated, and Russia's ability to sell oil, even if they can produce it, is eroding. It's not chaos, it's choreography. Everyone's playing their role. Ukraine targets the infrastructure. Russia retaliates against civilians. The West expresses concern but doesn't intervene. Markets adjust. And slowly, methodically, Russia's economic foundation cracks. Let's follow the money, because that's ultimately what this is about. Russia's economy runs on oil, not entirely, but enough that when oil revenues drop, everything else suffers. And Ukraine has been systematically targeting that revenue stream throughout 2025. Here are the numbers. As of October 2025, 38 to 40% of Russia's oil refining capacity was offline, not reduced. Offline. 70% of those shutdowns were directly caused by Ukrainian strikes. 21 out of 38 major Russian refineries were damaged in 2025. That's over half. The damage estimates from September 2024 to February 2025 alone were $707 million. By the end of 2025, that number's probably doubled. Now, you might think, so what? Russia can just export crude oil instead of refined products. Except that's not how it works. Refined products, gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, sell for more than crude oil. The profit margin is in the refining. When Ukraine destroys refineries, they're not just disrupting production, they're destroying profit. And it's showing. Russia's GDP growth has slowed from 4.3% in 2020 to about 1% in 2025. Inflation is over 8%. The ruble has weakened significantly, though it rallied somewhat later in the year. Russian refineries have taken out $14 billion in emergency loans through July 2025. $14 billion. That's not maintenance money, that's survival money. And then there are the practical consequences. Gasoline production in Russia dropped 10%. Gas production, as in natural gas, dropped 27% at its peak in September. Fuel shortages hit southern regions, including Crimea. Gas stations instituted 20-liter purchase limits. People were getting into fist fights at gas pumps. A resident in Simferopol told Al Jazeera, "There are long lines and fist fights at gas stations. Every day I see cars that ran out of fuel and left on the curb. That's not wartime propaganda. That's Russians. In Russia, running out of gas. Russia extended its fuel export ban through summer 2025 to try to stabilize domestic supply. They instituted price caps to prevent inflation. They deployed emergency fuel reserves. But you can only do that for so long before the reserves run out. Now let's zoom out. Russia spends between $2 to $3 billion per month prosecuting this war. Weapons, ammunition, salaries, equipment, logistics, it all costs money. And that money comes primarily from oil and gas revenues. When Ukraine hits oil infrastructure, they're not just causing explosions. They're cutting off the cash flow that funds Russian artillery shells, pays Russian soldiers, builds Russian tanks. And here's where it gets really interesting. This strategy doesn't require Western approval. Ukraine built these long-range missiles themselves, the Neptune, the Flamingo. These aren't American weapons with usage restrictions. They're Ukrainian weapons, which means Ukraine can strike wherever they want, whenever they want. The economic warfare Ukraine is waging isn't about destroying Russia's oil industry entirely. It's about making it unprofitable, making it unreliable, making buyers and insurers nervous, creating a slow bleed that compounds over time. And it's working. Russian oil exports are down, revenues are down, budget deficits are growing. The Russian central bank is having to intervene repeatedly to stabilize the ruble. This is the stuff that ends wars. Not glorious battlefield victories, not dramatic peace treaties, just boring economics. Spreadsheets, cash flow problems, budget shortfalls. Putin can't fund a war he can't afford, and Ukraine is making sure he can't afford it. Here's where this gets interesting, because what we're watching isn't just about one war between two countries. This is about the future of warfare itself. For decades, military doctrine has focused on taking territory, destroying enemy forces, controlling strategic positions. World War II was won by controlling land. The Cold War was defined by nuclear deterrence. Modern wars were about precision strikes and shock and awe campaigns. But what Ukraine is doing is different. They're not trying to occupy Russian territory, not primarily. They're not trying to destroy the Russian military in the field, though they're doing that too. They're attacking the economic engine that makes Russian military operations possible. So it's not battlefield warfare, it's systems warfare. Find the critical nodes that enable your enemy to fight and destroy those nodes. And Russia has a massive vulnerability. They're a petrostate. 30 to 50% of their federal budget comes from oil and gas. They've built their entire economy around exporting hydrocarbons, which means if you can disrupt those exports, you can strangle their economy. Ukraine has figured this out, and they've been executing it methodically all year. Look at the pattern. In September 2025 alone, Ukraine conducted 40 strikes on Russian oil infrastructure. 40 in 1 month. By the end of September, they'd hit 70 targets total. Refineries, storage facilities, pipelines, and now export terminals. This isn't random. This is a campaign. And it's escalating. The Novorossiysk strike represents a new phase. Before, Ukraine was mostly hitting refineries, production facilities, but now they're hitting export terminals. They're going after the point where Russia actually makes money, where oil gets loaded onto tankers and sold to international buyers. That's strategic, because you can repair a refinery, you can rebuild damaged equipment, but when export terminals are unreliable, when buyers can't trust that their tankers will be loaded on schedule, they go elsewhere. They find other suppliers. And once you lose market share in the oil business, it's hard to get it back. Now let's talk about Russia's response options, because they're limited. Option 1, increase air defense around oil facilities. They're already doing this, but it means pulling air defense systems from the front line from major cities. It means spreading limited resources even thinner. Option 2, strike back at Ukrainian energy infrastructure. They've been doing this too. Russia has repeatedly hit Ukrainian power plants, heating facilities, electrical grids, but it doesn't stop the drone strikes. It just creates a tit-for-tat cycle. Option 3, end the war. Negotiate a settlement. Stop the conflict that's bleeding your economy dry. But Putin can't do that without looking weak. And looking weak, for him, is existential. So Russia's stuck. They can't defend everything. They can't meaningfully retaliate in a way that stops Ukrainian strikes. And they can't end the war without admitting defeat. Meanwhile, Ukraine keeps building missiles. The Flamingo production rate as of September 2025 was 50 units per month. They're targeting 210 per month. That's a lot of missiles. And remember, these are missiles with 3,000-kilometer range. That reaches Moscow, the Urals, the Caspian Sea, anywhere in Western Russia, anywhere the oil infrastructure exists. What we're watching is the weaponization of economics, not economic sanctions imposed by governments. Those are slow and full of loopholes. This is direct action. Precision strikes against the specific infrastructure that generates revenue. And the strategic implication is enormous. You don't need to defeat an enemy militarily if you can bankrupt them economically. Russia's learning this the hard way. We've seen this before. Not exactly like this, but close enough. Go back to World War II. The Allied strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany. One of the primary targets wasn't German troops. It wasn't even German cities, not initially. It was German oil. Operation Tidal Wave in 1943 targeted the Ploiești oil fields in Romania, which supplied about 30% of Germany's oil. The Allies lost dozens of bombers in the raid, but they kept coming back because they understood, take away Germany's fuel and their tanks don't roll. Their planes don't fly. By 1944, Allied bombing had reduced German oil production by 90%. That's not why Germany lost the war. There were many factors. But it's why German divisions ran out of fuel during critical offensives, why Luftwaffe sorties dropped dramatically, why the Wehrmacht couldn't maintain its mechanized advantage. Destroy the oil, and you destroy the war machine. Fast forward to 1991, the Gulf War. Before coalition ground forces entered Kuwait, the air campaign systematically destroyed Iraqi oil infrastructure, not just military targets, refineries, pipelines, storage facilities. The goal was to cripple Iraq's ability to fund future aggression. Or look at the sanctions campaign against Iran. For decades, Western powers have tried to limit Iran's oil exports, not by bombing, though Israel has occasionally struck Iranian facilities, but by making it economically difficult for Iran to sell oil. And it's worked, partially. Iran's economy has struggled. Their regional ambitions are constrained by budget realities. But here's what makes Ukraine's campaign different. They're doing it themselves. No coalition of 30 countries. No United States Air Force with stealth bombers. Just Ukrainian engineers building missiles from scavenged parts and launching them at targets 1,000 kilometers away. And it's working better than many international sanctions regimes. There's a lesson here about asymmetric warfare. Ukraine can't match Russia in troop numbers, tanks, artillery, but they can build cruise missiles. And those missiles can hit targets that really matter. It's the same lesson the Allies learned in World War II. You don't have to destroy the enemy's army in the field if you can destroy their ability to supply that army. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And right now it's rhyming in favor of Ukraine. The petrostate vulnerability that Russia has, it's not new. It's the same vulnerability Germany had, the same Iraq had, the same Iran has. When your economy depends on oil and someone figures out how to disrupt that oil, you're exposed. Russia is learning what Germany learned 80 years ago, the hard way. Let's pause there, because behind all these statistics and strategies are actual human beings. People trying to live their lives while their world burns. Imagine you're a worker at the Sheskeris terminal in Novorossiysk. You've worked there for 15 years. It's a good job, decent pay, benefits. You operate the equipment that loads crude oil onto tankers. You know the routine. Clock in, run your checks, supervise the pumping operations, clock out. And then one night, explosions. The ground shakes, alarms scream, fire erupts from multiple locations. You run. Everyone runs. You don't know if missiles are still coming. You don't know if you're safe. You just run. By morning, your workplace is shut down. Will you get paid? Will there even be a job when this is over? You have a mortgage, kids in school, bills to pay, and suddenly your stable job is very unstable. Or imagine you're a mother in Kyiv. Same night, your children are asleep. You've finally gotten them to bed after another long day of managing wartime life, the power cuts, the anxiety, the constant low-level fear, and then you hear the air raid sirens. Again, you wake your kids, you bundle them downstairs to the shelter. Again, you try to keep them calm while explosions echo across the city. Again, one of those missiles, or maybe it's a drone, you don't really know, hits an apartment building 3 blocks away. In the morning, you see the damage: blackened walls, blown out windows, emergency crews pulling through rubble. And you think that could have been us, that could have been my building, my children. How do you process that? How do you keep going? Or imagine you're a Russian soldier on the front line in Ukraine. You're exhausted, undersupplied. Your unit is supposed to receive fresh ammunition, but the shipments are delayed. Something about logistics problems, something about port disruptions. You don't know the details, you just know you're rationing bullets. And you're facing Ukrainian forces who seem to have plenty of ammunition, plenty of drones, plenty of everything. And you start to wonder, are we actually winning this war? Because it doesn't feel like winning. It feels like surviving, barely. Or imagine you're a Russian citizen in Crimea trying to buy gas. You wait in line for 90 minutes. When you finally reach the pump, the attendant says there's a 20-liter limit. That's not enough to fill your tank. It's barely enough to get you through the week. You argue. The attendant shrugs. It's not his decision, it's policy, because there's not enough fuel, because something about refineries being damaged, because something about the war. And you think we annexed Crimea 11 years ago because we were told it was strategically vital. We were told it would make Russia stronger. And now I can't even fill my gas tank. This is what war actually looks like. Not maps with moving arrows, not political speeches, just ordinary people trying to navigate impossible situations. A worker wondering if he'll have a job, a mother sheltering her children from explosions, a soldier rationing bullets, a citizen waiting in line for gas. Multiply that by millions. Repeat it every day for 3 years, going on 4. That's the human cost. And it's invisible in the spreadsheets and strategy papers, but it's real. It's happening right now. As we talk, and it's not ending anytime soon. Let's step back, because this isn't just about Russia and Ukraine. The ripple effects are global. First, energy markets. When 2.2 million barrels per day of Russian oil exports get disrupted, even temporarily, global prices react. Brent crude jumped 2% immediately after the Novorossiysk strike. That might not sound like much, but multiply it across global consumption. The world uses about 100 million barrels of oil per day. A 2% price increase means consumers globally are paying more for gas, heating oil, diesel. Airlines pay more for jet fuel. Shipping companies pay more for bunker fuel. Those costs get passed down to everyone. Europe is particularly exposed. Despite sanctions and rhetoric about cutting Russian energy dependence, Europe still imports Russian oil. When Russian exports are disrupted, European refineries scramble for alternatives. Norwegian oil, Middle Eastern oil, American shale. But alternatives cost more, and European economies are already struggling with inflation. Second, India and China. These are Russia's biggest oil customers right now. India massively increased its Russian oil imports after Western sanctions made Russian crude cheap. China has long-term supply contracts, but when export terminals get hit, those contracts become unreliable. If you're an Indian refiner and your Russian oil shipment is delayed because the terminal is damaged, you're going to start looking at other suppliers: Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the United States. Russia's already selling oil at a discount, $5 to $10 per barrel below market rates. If they also become unreliable suppliers, they'll have to discount even more. And at some point, the profit margin disappears entirely. Third, Kazakhstan. Remember, Kazakhstan routes some of its oil through Novorossiysk. They're not at war with anyone. They're just trying to export their resources. And now their shipments are disrupted because of a conflict they're not part of. This creates diplomatic tension. Kazakhstan depends on Russian infrastructure, but they're getting hurt by Russian vulnerabilities. They're starting to explore alternative export routes through Azerbaijan, through China. Anything to reduce dependence on Russian ports. Fourth, insurance and shipping. When a major port gets hit, insurance companies raise their risk assessments. Premiums go up. Some insurers refuse to cover ships docking in Russian ports entirely. The same thing happened after the Moskva sinking in 2022. Insurance costs for the Black Sea spiked. Some shipping companies stopped operating there. The market adjusted, but it took time, and Russia paid the price in higher costs and fewer buyers. Fifth, NATO and Western policy. The United States and Europe are watching this closely because Ukraine is demonstrating that you can wage effective warfare against a larger adversary through economic strikes. That's a model. If tensions with China escalate, do you go for military confrontation, or do you target critical infrastructure, trade routes, energy supplies? Ukraine is writing the playbook, and other countries are taking notes. Sixth precedent. This is the part that worries diplomats. What Ukraine is doing, striking deep inside Russia to destroy economic infrastructure, is escalatory. Russia will say it's terrorism. Ukraine will say it's legitimate military targeting. But the line between strategic bombing and economic warfare and outright attacks on civilian infrastructure, it's blurry. And once you establish precedent that these strikes are acceptable, other countries will follow. Imagine if tensions between Iran and Israel escalate. Does Israel strike Iranian oil terminals? Does Iran strike Israeli refineries? Where does it stop? Ukraine's campaign is effective, but it's also setting standards for future conflicts, and those standards might not be ones we want universally applied. Everything's connected. A drone strike on a Russian port affects oil prices in Europe, shipping routes in Asia, diplomatic calculations in Washington. Nothing happens in isolation anymore. We're all downstream of this war, whether we realize it or not. So here we are. Ukraine just struck Russia's second largest oil export terminal with homemade missiles built from scavenged engines. They shut down 2.2 million barrels per day of exports. They destroyed an S-400 air defense system. They caused hundreds of millions of dollars in immediate damage and potentially billions in long-term economic impact. And they did it the same night. Russia launched over 400 drones and 18 missiles at civilian targets in Kyiv. What does that tell us? It tells us that this war has evolved. It's no longer just about territory in Donbass or sovereignty over Crimea. It's about economic survival. Can Russia afford to continue this war? Can Ukraine make it too expensive for them to continue? The answer, increasingly, is that Ukraine can make it very expensive indeed. But here's the thing about economic warfare. It doesn't produce clean victories. There's no moment where you take the enemy capital and plant your flag. There's no dramatic surrender ceremony. There's just a slow, grinding depletion of resources until one side can't continue. And that means more nights like November 14th, more oil terminals burning, more apartment buildings hit, more workers losing jobs, and mothers sheltering children and soldiers rationing ammunition, because both sides are locked in now. Ukraine can't stop striking Russian infrastructure. It's their best strategy. Russia can't stop retaliating against Ukrainian civilians. It's all they have left. And the world watches and adjusts and factors the chaos into spreadsheets and risk assessments. This is what modern war looks like. Not armies clashing on open battlefields, not fighter jets dueling in the sky, just long-range strikes against infrastructure, economic strangulation, and civilians caught in the crossfire. It's effective. Ukraine's energy campaign has achieved more than 3 years of Western sanctions. They've put real pressure on Russia's war making capability. They've demonstrated that you don't need to be a military superpower to strike at the heart of a larger adversary. But effective doesn't mean good. It doesn't mean moral. It just means it works. And that's the uncomfortable truth we're sitting with. Ukraine is fighting for its survival against an invading force. They're using the tools available to them. They're hitting targets that make strategic sense. But every strike that damages Russian infrastructure, every refinery fire, every export terminal shutdown doesn't just hurt Putin's government. It hurts ordinary Russians, workers, families, people who didn't choose this war and can't end it. Just like every Russian missile that hits Kyiv doesn't just hurt Ukraine's government, it hurts ordinary Ukrainians, children, mothers, people who are just trying to survive. War doesn't distinguish between guilty and innocent very well. It spreads damage indiscriminately. And the longer it goes on, the more damage spreads. So what's the answer? When does this end? Honestly, I don't know. Maybe when Russia's economy finally breaks under the pressure. Maybe when Putin decides the cost is too high and negotiates. Maybe when Ukraine runs out of missiles or Russia runs out of money. Or maybe it doesn't end. Maybe it just continues. A slow burn conflict where Ukraine methodically dismantles Russia's economic infrastructure while Russia pounds Ukrainian cities into rubble, year after year, until both sides are exhausted. That's the dark possibility nobody wants to talk about. But what I do know is this: the Novorossiysk strike matters, not because it's going to end the war tomorrow, but because it represents a shift. Ukraine isn't just defending anymore. They're attacking the foundations of Russia's war machine, and that gives them leverage they didn't have a year ago, leverage they're using. So we'll see what happens. We'll see if economic pressure can accomplish what battlefield victories haven't. We'll see if Putin blinks first. But tonight, somewhere on the Black Sea coast, the Sheskari's terminal is still shut down. The fires have been extinguished, but the damage remains. 2.2 million barrels per day that aren't flowing, hundreds of millions of dollars that aren't being made. And in Kyiv, mothers are still putting their children to bed, wondering if tonight will be the night another attack comes. That's where we are. That's the story. Not simple, not clean, just real.